is us. Is this us?
It's our second day in the Pilbara when it starts to rain.
Now I remember your name.
I'm Ellen, the photographer.
Yeah.
Sarah.
Yeah.
Jane.
A bit of a talk, eh?
Yeah, okay.
Up on the northern coast, a cyclone is bearing down, but where we are, it's muggy, 42 degrees, and the sky is grey. It's sort of looming.
Shall we talk under there so we don't get wet?
The clouds burst open. We run out of the car. We gather under a tin roof. It's got holes in it. It looks like an old carport. It's loud. Looking out from the tin shed, there is nothing as far as the eye can see. The earth is a deep red purple colour. It's dotted with a yellowy green spinifex. There's no one around us for hundreds of kilometres. This is mining country. This is where almost all of Australia's iron ore comes from.
So tell me about Banjima country. Oh, whoa.
I don't worry about that lightning, you don't get frightened of lightning.
We're here to meet Brian Tucker, a Banjima and Nibali man. We're on the traditional lands of the Banjima people.
This is where I gave my evidence to our native title.
Here?
Yeah, here.
Okay.
He's brought us to the place where he practices law and culture. It's called Wirralamurra.
What did it mean water to us? My great-great-grandfather roamed this land.
We're also here with his sister, Juliet.
Sarah, we're going to this side. You bring your chair.
Oh, yeah, sure. So Wirralamurra is a block of land that has been carved out of a much larger pastoral station. It's known as Mulga Downs. And Mulga Downs is the reason we're here.
Well, maybe with the rain stopped a little bit, if you're happy to tell us a bit of a history of Wirralamurra.
I'll be happy to tell you about
We need to know what you want out of it. We don't know, see, we only know we came out here to meet you and we're interested
of course.
but we don't know what is it that you want to know, what is it that you need to know.
Because Mulga Downs is a place that Gina Rinehart once called home.
So basically, we're doing a podcast series about Hancock prospecting, Gina Rinehart. So we wanted to come to hear your perspectives, good or bad or otherwise. We come to this with an open mind.
Oh, where should I start?
I'm Sarah Martin. I've been a journalist for almost 20 years. I've covered business and politics from small towns in WA to the Press Gallery in Canberra. And from Guardian Australia, this is Gina.
Oh, Gina Rinehart.
Thank you.
A podcast series about Gina Rinehart, Australia's richest person.
When it was a cattle and sheep station, you had the homestead and the Hancock family lived there, and then there was a camp.
So you can go there, we can go there and have a look.
Shall we go now?
Yeah, we get a camper on the way.
It's a bit of a big hike.
We go through this way, this back one here.
No, you don't go that way. Get bogged.
Gina Rinehart is estimated to be worth almost $40 billion. Her company, Hancock Prospecting, is Australia's largest private company. It pays more than $2 billion in company tax a year and employs more than 4,000 Australians. Last year alone, it made more than $5 billion in profit. Has there ever been an Australian billionaire like Gina Rinehart in your career?
Gosh, it's a good question. When I downloaded Hancock Prospecting's 2024 financials, the number was so big I had to copy it and put it in a Word document, and then I had to put commas in there because it was just this stream of numbers. Well, how many zeros are there? How many millions or billions are we in?
Her empire now extends beyond iron ore mining. She's got interest in rare earth, lithium, gold, coal, cattle, agricultural holdings, even clothing. And as her wealth continues to rise, so does her power and influence. Gina has traced a path from right here in the Pilbara to the corridors of power in Canberra, even to Washington with Donald Trump. Trump is someone Gina admires. She sees in him the same policies that she's been advocating for a long time.
You know, to me, she's sort of like a female Donald Trump.
Since Donald Trump's victory, we've seen billionaires like Elon Musk have extraordinary access and influence over government. Some are calling it a new era of oligarchy in the United States. And as we approach our own federal election, Gina Rinehart is on her own mission to make Australia great again.
I think she wants to be Peter Dutton's Elon Musk, and that worries me.
Just like she sees Elon Musk is hanging out in the Oval Office with Donald Trump, Gina wants to be hanging out at the lodge.
She's been openly courting Australian politicians. She's been seen with Pauline Hanson in Thailand, and she seems particularly close with Peter Dutton, the opposition leader.
Peter Dutton called Gina Rinehart his dear friend. The Liberal Party is financially dependent on Gina Rinehart because she's their second biggest donor. People should absolutely know that Gina Rinehart is doing everything she can to get Peter Dutton elected, and she's not, stupid. She's doing that because she knows she'll get her payback for it.
She wants to be able to write the rules. She wants a free pass. She wants to abolish environmental protection laws. She wants weaker regulation when it comes to IR. She wants a seat at the table.
We've spoken to her critics and defenders to tell the story of Gina Rinehart. The money, the court cases, and all of the drama.
It's sad, but we've seen this story before. I mean, this is Citizen Kane. There are figures from the Old Testament. You can change the uniforms, you can change the time stamp. This is an ancient story.
It's impossible to separate the story of the Hancock family's fortune from the red iron ore dirt of the Pilbara. And it's on that iron ore country where Gina Rinehart's story really begins.
I've got my voice going down a bit low.
That's the hymn.
This is episode 1, Becoming Mrs Rinehart.
You're singing the story of this country?
Where the old people walked from place to place. Right, we need to go to Mulgadan.
Okay, let's go. Yeah.
Mulgadan and have a look there.
We're heading towards the homestead where Gina would have lived when she was at Mulga Downs.
And we're driving down the road that Gina Rinehart would have taken to school, and I imagine it's in better nick now than it was back then.
It's bumpy, the road is flooded. It's almost like driving through a wetland. There's, a lot of bird life.
Big wedgie up in that tree to the right.
Oh, look at that.
We pass a huge wedge-tailed eagle on the way in.
Isn't it beautiful?
How beautiful are you?
Water all around.
It's very pretty with the water.
It's incredible to look out the window and see how isolated it is.
But also incredible that this was your backyard. Have 1 million acres of backyard.
We stop the cars and get out at this muddy brown creek. We're told Gina used to swim in it as a kid.
No, we're coming to that creek where Gina nearly drowned.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think you would have been able to hear that over the engine.
That's our producer, Joe Koning.
Brian just said we're coming up to the creek where Gina almost drowned.
Brian's family tell a story of Gina almost drowning in the creek. They say she was rescued by one of his relatives, Greg Tucker. There's actually a video on YouTube of him talking about the incident.
My brother and me and some other kids, we used to come down swimming in the flood. The flood was getting higher. He's running. So Gina more or less went too deep and started to sink going in the tide. And seeing I was close, I jumped in to save her, pulled her by the ponytail, pulled her back, and I was up to my neck in water. So we got out. All those kids on the bank all cried about it. That's where I saved her life.
It's really good to be here, isn't it?
Yeah.
To imagine her as a kid playing in the creek, and this would be a pretty incredible place to grow up. You'd be so lonely, wouldn't you?
Gina was born Georgina Hope Hancock in 1954. Her parents were Langley George and Hope Hancock. She grew up in the Pilbara, living here at Mulga Downs from the age of 4. The station had been in the family since 1915. It was run by Gina's father and his father before him. And it's absolutely huge. It's almost 1 million acres of land.
She baked like a cake, you know, in that Pilbara heat.
Debbie Marshall wrote a really great biography on the Hancock family. She's an investigative journalist and author who lives in Tasmania. Did you find, as you said about researching Gina Rinehart, did you detect a pattern where people were reluctant to talk?
That's an understatement. Nobody wanted to talk about Gina Rinehart. You know, the refrain was something from, no thanks, I don't want to be sued, or no thanks, I don't want to lose my house.
So it's very apparent in Debbie's book that Gina's heavily influenced by her father, Lang. Everywhere you look, there's references to Gina's upbringing and how isolated she was at the station and how much time she spent with Lang Hancock.
She's a chip off the old block, make no mistake about it. She was raised out there in that lonely, isolated, vast Pilbara and Mulga Downs station with, you know, as one of Hancock's contemporaries said, she was as lonely as a lizard. But she loved that because she had her father's full attention. And he taught her that you can do anything, really. You've just got to keep fighting. And what did they talk about? They talked about minerals. Minerals. Minerals to the right, minerals to the left, minerals as far as the eye can see. That's what Mulga Downs was all about.
Gina's mother, Hope, developed breast cancer when Gina was very young, and so she spent a lot of time with her father, Lang.
Lang decided it was a really good idea to shield Hope from visitors. So there'd be nobody at the station sometimes for months. They wouldn't see anyone else at all. Can you imagine living like that when you're a child?
When the dust has settled and history is objectively written, this great explosion of industry may be largely attributed to the man who discovered these great deposits of high-grade iron ore and who fought single-mindedly for their development. Pastoralist, prospector and mining entrepreneur Langley George Hancock.
Lang Hancock is a giant in Australian iron ore history, but also a pioneer of Western Australia and a hugely well-known figure in the West. He's a man who's described as having the Pilbara in his blood. He knew the landscape like the back of his hand. He's often credited as the man who discovered iron ore in the Pilbara, and he would become one of Australia's first mining magnates.
Ms Hancock, your public image always seems to represent you as being a sort of human bulldozer. How did you achieve that, do you think?
The natural upbringing of a chap who's been on the land most of his working life.
Tell us about her adoration of Lang.
Adoration's the perfect word. She absolutely idolised him. He could do no wrong. He could do absolutely no wrong at all. I mean, they just shadowed each other. He adored her as well, make no mistake about it. He called her the young fella because they'd expected a boy, but they didn't think they could have children at all. By the time she came along, they were just amazed and mesmerised by this baby who just changed their life completely.
Yeah, this is our homestead in here.
It was pretty incredible to arrive at the gates of the homestead. And where did the family live?
Oh, Gina's family.
Yeah.
They're living there.
Yeah. There's quite a lot of buildings and it's now abandoned. There's a bunch of old buildings falling down. You can see there's the old airstrip overgrown with grass. It's where Lang, who was a very famous bush pilot, would have landed his aircraft.
See that clearing?
Oh, yeah.
Over there, yeah.
And just where the old shacks up there, that's where all our family stayed.
Yeah, okay.
But everybody all worked here.
Yeah. So at this time, a lot of the workers at Mulga Downs were Indigenous. That included several members of Brian's family. His dad was a dogger for the Hancocks. He would go out and hunt dingoes and bring back their scalps. If he wasn't successful, he wouldn't get paid. Brian's auntie was a cook.
Would have been hard work, imagine.
Hard
in the
work.
heat.
Hard work. From dawn to dusk. That's what it is. Every day of the week.
It was fascinating to be there to reflect on Gina Rinehart's humble beginnings at Mulga Downs, because as it happened, on that same day, Gina Rinehart was thousands of kilometres away in the US for Donald Trump's inauguration.
Hello.
Hello, is that Tony?
Hi, Sarah.
One of the people Gina caught up with while she was there was Toni Holt-Kramer. She's the founder of the Trump support group, the Trumpettes. Their connection goes way back to the first Trump presidency.
I met Gina at Mar-a-Lago. It was probably about 7 or 8 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Trump was president, and she was having dinner there with some people, and we had mutual acquaintances, and somebody said, "Oh, you must meet Gina Rinehart. You two would have so much in common." I walked over to her table and said, "Excuse me, my name is Toni Holt-Kramer, and I understand that I must meet you." And that's how we met, and we became friends immediately. I even have the photograph, I think, of the first night we met, believe it or not.
And you hit it off straight away?
Immediately. She's an incredible woman. I mean, she to me, and now that I've had some history with her, never enough, because she's so amazing to me. She does so much good. I'm so impressed with her through the years. To me, she's sort of like a female Donald Trump.
In what way?
She has the right values for me. I can't speak for other people, but for me and America at this point, she thinks so normally, so intelligently, and she's only for the betterment of Australia. She loves Australia with her heart and soul. On the night of the election, on November 5th, 2024, I sat with her and her very close friend. The ballroom at Mar-a-Lago was jammed. I mean, it was from one end to the other. And every time we got another state, you would hear, "Oh, yay, applause, carrying on, screaming, excitement." And everybody's eyes were peeled on the television, feeling very celebratory. We were all waiting for it to happen. And as the numbers came in more and more, it was apparent that the people had spoken.
Do you think she will be successful in bringing some of Trump's ideas to Australia, inspired by Trump and your movement?
Oh, yes, indeed I do. I think she's inspired by Trump, but I think Gina herself has a lot of great ideas. Gina's an extremely brilliant woman. She, too, has that force that Trump has. Her belief is part of her blood. It's part of her brain. She didn't all of a sudden become a believer in the better things for Australia. We've talked about it a little bit. I believe she's always believed. She loves it. It's her country. She loves Australia madly. Her father was also loved Australia madly.
There was a report at the time of, I think it was after the election night party or possibly after the inauguration, and it was talking about Gina Rinehart she'd be a great candidate for Australia's ambassador to Washington.
I have no doubt she'd be a great ambassador. I wish she would be an ambassador to Washington from Australia. And I wish she would get the Trumpettes involved with her in Australia. I mean, it would be great.
How you feel?
Yeah. I don't know.
Maybe I expected something a bit more like Country Style magazine, you know, like a romantic homestead or...
Absolutely not.
It's pretty rugged. It's interesting to wonder if she hadn't grown up here and she hadn't inherited her father's legacy, would she be the Gina Rinehart she is today?
So around the age of 8, Gina is sent away from the homestead to a boarding school in Perth called St Hilda's. It's a very prestigious boarding school for girls. And you spoke to people who knew Gina as a young girl, and you obviously spoke to people at her school. What was little Gina like?
Little Gina was spoken a very, very whispery little voice that she still does, which is incredibly disconcerting when you realise she's got a will of iron.
There's actually a documentary from around this time which captures Gina as a schoolgirl. The BBC come out to Australia to film Lang Hancock.
I think my father's nearly perfect. He's awfully good at sport, mainly table tennis and football and cricket. He's good at swimming and the rest of them too.
Gina's in these videos. She's in her school uniform. She's got her little pigtails in and she's talking about Lang Hancock.
He's not very good in the house though. He hates washing up and he'll never do it. He never makes his bed. He always leaves it for us. He's awfully untidy. I think he's quite handsome.
When she was sent to school, I think it was very difficult for her to try to fit in with girls who, you know, many of them had come from Perth and lived in, you know, waterfront mansions in Perth.
For Georgina, this means virtually leading a double life. In the holidays, she can chase kangaroos, swim in rock pools, and ride for a whole day without coming to the boundary of her father's station. For the rest of the year, she is disciplined, subject to petty restrictions, her horizons the four walls of a classroom.
Having had Georgina for 2 years in the class, I find that she's rather a normal child, unexpectedly perhaps. I find that she's very loyal once she likes you. She's very loyal towards you. I generally joke about the fact that she's going home to this great station and she just shrugs it off. Part of life. She was just born to it.
Some of her school friends recall Lang coming down and sitting with her for hours and hours and hours in the car. It's a very posh car, talking about minerals, we assume. But she couldn't wait to get back there.
So Gina is going to school in Perth, but she always wants to get back to the Pilbara.
That's in her blood. That's where she wanted to be.
But when you talk about your job doing the windmill rounds, if the windmills didn't blow or something was wrong, then the stock weren't fed and they died.
Alan Jones, an admirer of Gina's, recounts how happy her childhood was.
I love the story. You had the nuts and bolts, and if your dad up on the windmill wanted to fix something, you had to have the right nut and the right bolt or you got in all sorts of trouble. And you went home and it was red dust, and red dust was dirty. Gina's mother said, well, your job's to sweep the floor twice a day. There was no water outside, there were no gardens, no nothing. I mean, none of this is understood. Very few Australians can identify with this. An extraordinary childhood.
Another thing that's really interesting to note is already at this very young age, Gina has been talked about as the heir apparent to the Hancock fortune that Lang is very quickly amassing from his iron ore wealth. There's an anecdote about him bringing 10 cars to Gina's school in her final year so she could choose one. Apparently she picks the Volvo. Very sensible.
Yet this is a girl who knows that one day she may be the richest heiress in the state.
There was no other heir, in his opinion. I mean, she was it. There were no siblings. Who else was going to take over the job?
But for Georgina, the station represents everything that matters. One day it will be hers, and so will the challenging, sometimes frustrating way of life that goes with it.
As she gets older, she'll have a lot of responsibilities to undertake, and with no brothers, and being an only child, everything will devolve upon her.
He just wanted her to learn at his knee, and that's what she did.
It's not long after this that Gina starts getting involved in the family business.
She was sitting in meetings with Singaporean Prime Minister, with Margaret Thatcher. She learnt, for example, very conservative politics. For example, she had a meeting with her father, with Margaret Thatcher. Her father said, you should be like her, neat, trim, beautifully dressed all the time and have an iron will. Well, that certainly happened.
What sort of ideology did Lang instill in Gina from a young age?
The ideology that, she could take on the boys at their own game and win, and that she should. B, that she shouldn't back down. He thought the bureaucrats and public servants and politicians, etc., were all a bunch of fools, and that you don't take no for an answer. So, Gina, we know, is as tough as old boots. I mean, she's actually tougher than her father. I mean, he said that himself. In many ways, a lot of people, whether they be politicians, bureaucrats, whatever, when they were talking to Gina Rinehart, they thought they were talking to Lang. It was basically the same things that were coming out of her mouth.
And remember that the whole of Western civilization is built on mining, so that there's nothing that you can make that doesn't come out of the ground.
Now, we don't know what sort of profits we'll be making on this entirely. We hope we will be making profits, but if we lose money, well, it is a risk venture and we'll be losing money from it.
Gina also picked up on some of Lang's more radical ideas, like using nuclear bombs to blow up mine sites.
If you could use a nuclear explosion, would you do so with a trouble-free mind? Oh, yes.
A hole will be bored down here, and into this will be lowered the hydrogen bomb, which is about 6 feet high. And then after that will be lowered the atomic bomb. Now this atomic bomb will be set off, and that will set off the hydrogen bomb.
I don't think I can overestimate just how important it was to Gina Rinehart that she did what her father wanted her to do. She would never have gone in to do anything else.
Because she wanted his approval or because that was her destiny?
I think it was both.
But on a purely emotional basis, how does it feel to look at all that iron ore lying in the ground that one day is going to be yours?
Bloody good.
Oh, it's so hot. I don't know how you...
hot now?
Yeah. How come you're in tracksuit pants? You must be hot.
Hey?
Hot in tracksuit pants?
No, you're right, it's light, it's thin. Feel it, it's thin, this.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
You're used to the weather.
But I'm used to the weather.
Yeah. I mean, it's always kind of struck me as this sort of in some ways that she didn't really have a choice to be the kind of person she is, because, I mean, this is where she grew up. This is where she was marinated in Lang's politics, where she didn't have a lot of outside influence other than her father. Like, she talks really fondly of it. Like, she doesn't talk about it being hard or isolated, or like, she talks about how much she loved it, how much she loved being with Lang, and what a great childhood she had.
Did you know the team behind the Gina series also make a daily news podcast? It's called Full Story. If you want analysis of the most important stories of the week, then you can find it wherever you're listening to Gina right now. Just search for Full Story.
The 1970s would bring huge changes to Gina's life. So let's talk about Gina as she sort of comes of age. She has a very short stint at university. Can you tell us what happens?
She didn't believe in some of the philosophies of the university, particularly I think it was one professor.
She leaves the safety and comfort of WA and goes to Sydney to study a Bachelor of Economics. The university is not just physically miles away from WA, but it's also a world away from the politics and ideology of her father and what she's grown up with in the Pilbara. She doesn't last long. She later says that the university was teaching all the wrong things.
She just wanted to go back to where she grew up and start to work her birthright, which was minerals.
She drops out of university and goes back to work for Hancock Prospecting. Lang could not have been prouder. That same year, she meets a man called Greg Milton. Can you tell us about Gina and Greg Milton, her first husband?
Yeah, I can. So Greg was travelling, working in Australia from Britain.
Greg was an Englishman who was working at a hardware store owned by the Hancock family in the Pilbara.
Met the young and really, I have to say, quite gorgeous-looking Gina, brunette, smiley, happy young woman.
The story goes that Gina went in to buy a can of paint. He gave her a lift home.
And they just fell in love with each other. You know, it was this huge love affair, much to Lang's disgust.
Greg and Gina are married within a year. A few years later, they have their first child, John. His birth was front page news. The Women's Weekly ran a cover story titled Australia's Richest Baby. But giving birth to John didn't slow Gina down. She was back in the office within 2 weeks. She even had a double brick enclosure built in the office so people couldn't hear John crying.
And the son, John Langley, is yet another in need of Gina's time. Time that's increasingly more valuable as the deals are done and more iron ore is taken from the earth.
So there's an image in this old ABC documentary, This Day Tonight, of a happy, smiling family with Gina holding John and Greg smiling alongside her. They're standing in front of one of the family's private planes, which is named John Langley. Gina's asked about John.
Is it possible, though, to give him a normal upbringing?
As long as we can give the most normal sort of balanced base that is possible, he'll be able to handle this very well.
The following year, the family welcomed another child, Bianca.
You know, I think we need to be fair and to really remember what a beautiful mother she was. I mean, she carted those kids around the station, you know, on her hip. She really, really loved those children. And I think that says something really nice about Gina. And not everyone's got much to say about Gina that's nice, but I think we have to be fair.
Although, I say to Debbie, 2 of her 4 children aren't speaking to her these days.
Well, yes, Sarah, there is that. That's the story for later.
There's also this really peculiar thing that happens. Before Gina marries Greg Milton, he changes his surname to Hayward. So she becomes Georgina Hayward. Do you know why?
I think, no, it was always a mystery to me and remains so, but I think it was because people couldn't be sniffing around like journalists going, who's Greg Milton? Oh, okay, well, he's just a bit of a nobody from the UK who's married the boss's daughter. So they made him change his name. Where the Hayward came from, I have no idea.
So it's your understanding that they made him change his name?
Yes, so that's certainly what he told me, yeah.
Guardian Australia was unable to track down Greg Milton. If Gina's early life was an education in the world of Lang Hancock, then 1979 is the year she puts that into practice. It's the year of Lang's 70th birthday, and Gina decides to do something special. She decides to charter a jumbo jet.
They did this, what I think is slightly ludicrous flight, and they take people, journalists and dignitaries around the Pilbara, showing them holes in the ground, you know, mine sites or potential mine sites.
The plane is going to fly around Australia and inspect mining sites and talk about unlocking the great potential of Australia's mining industry. It's called the Wake Up Australia Tour. Gina had also secured some VIPs for the flight. Among them was Edward Teller, the Hungarian-born American scientist who's known as the father of the hydrogen bomb. Also on the list was the former Prime Minister, John Gorton. But as the flight approaches, things start falling apart. Both of them drop out. And then Lang himself is too sick to fly.
And when Lang couldn't do it, Gina would take the microphone.
And as I recall, the person who essentially welcomed us on the plane was Gina Rinehart.
She had a different voice to the voice she has now. That's one of the things I can remember. I would say that her voice was softer.
It was hard to find people who'd been on the flight because a lot of them have since passed away. But we did track down Andrew Clark. He was a journalist reporting on the flight at the time.
It was a strange trip, obviously, but I can remember I was on a bit of a high at the end of it. You know, it was just such a weird thing. So obviously Gina Rinehart was not a figure at that time, so people were interested in observing her, but she wasn't what you might call flamboyant. I didn't see in her at that time what you might call an emphatic personality. I saw a personality that had very strong views, very single-minded, but not an emphatic personality. It was Lang Hancock's daughter politely welcoming us on the plane and explaining what the mission was, so to speak.
How do you think she handled the pressure?
She certainly fulfilled that role, and she was articulate and she was on message.
Hello, Dr. Teller, can you hear me? How are you?
I can hear you very well.
Even though not physically on the plane, guests still get the chance to hear from Edward Teller, who Gina dials in over the radio.
It's wonderful to hear you. It's the first time I've made a phone chat with you like this up at 35,000 feet.
What do you recall of that conversation?
Yes, I do recall that conversation. I mean, here we are on this flight, sponsored by Lang Hancock, who was very close to Edward Teller. They were bib and bub in the sort of campaign for nuclear power, very much along the lines of this is the way forward.
Also on the flight was the infamous Joe Bjelke-Petersen and his wife Flo. They were good friends of the family.
Then Premier Joe Bjelke-Petersen will talk to you about the proposed West Australian to Queensland rail link.
I remember him being on that trip, and we landed in Queensland, and he said, can't you feel that the air is different here? And can't you breathe the air? It's more free, etc., etc. You just saw this a remarkable vista of Australia, Western Australia and the Northern Territory.
While you're looking at these sites, are you getting sort of a running commentary from Gina or Bjelke-Petersen or?
Absolutely. How the opening up of the Northwest Shelf, uranium mining in the Northern Territory, expansion of the Pilbara, how all of that would transform Australia and transform the world as long as government got out of the way and taxes were dropped.
Any positive PR that Gina was hoping to get from the flight didn't eventuate. In fact, it was broadly ridiculed by the media. In a satirical piece for the Bulletin, Philip Adams wrote that the trip had embarked on the most historic jumbo since the one Hannibal used across the Alps. He finishes the piece saying there was wild applause for the pilot because he'd made the entire journey in a plane with only a right wing.
That didn't go down well. She'd sniff and say, well, I don't think that was necessary to write like that.
And I mean, I guess the other thing that strikes me about the importance of this flight, at least symbolically, is it makes very clear to people that Gina is following in the footsteps of her father.
That's right. So in that sense, and maybe the significance of this was not obvious at the time, but in that sense, it was the introduction of Gina Rinehart, or Gina Hayward, as you say she was then, to her role of continuing Lang Hancock's proselytising for a deregulated, mining-led Australian economy with low taxes. And so she has fulfilled that role, I would say, to a much greater extent than was anticipated at the time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, that sort of strikes me as the first time she's sort of in the public eye. This is her moment to sort of step up to the plate.
I suppose, in a way, looking back on it, that is the main significance of that weird 2 days. I mean, we all have different lives, than we had before, and so my life is not related back to that. But I do sometimes see Gina Rinehart on television or hear her or whatever, and think back on Gina Hayward, But Gina Rinehart is a different person to the one I observed back in 1979.
In many ways, the flight marks the evolution of Gina. She makes clear that she can be the figurehead of the company. She tells a reporter that the House of Hancock comes first. Nothing will stand in the way of that. There's also another part of her life that she's prepared to leave behind, a part of her life that doesn't align with the future of Hancock prospecting, and that's her first husband, Greg. In a clip from This Day Tonight, that 1976 documentary, Gina is asked about Greg.
Where does he fit in the family empire?
Well, we both think it's best that he has outside interests rather than just being engulfed in whatever I'm doing.
But purely outside interests or outside interests as well, do you think?
I think it's if he has his main interests apart from just the family.
He said he went home one day and Gina was packing up to go overseas with her father. And he knew that there was not much point him hanging around, that it was over, it was done. But it tells me that she's made of tough stuff, that when it was over, it was over.
Within 2 years, their divorce is finalised. Gina abandons the surname Hayward, the surname they allegedly had forced Greg to adopt. And Greg would go 20 years without seeing his kids.
I met Greg when I was doing the book. Lovely man, really lovely man, but still in some ways utterly, utterly broken. Not that the marriage had ended, but because of his situation with the 2 children, the oldest, John and Bianca. He was completely heartbroken. He hadn't seen those kids for years. He told me this dreadful story where when he was seeing the children when they were young, very young, that he was made to sit in the garage to see them. And he said, Debbie, it was so humiliating, my own children, that I couldn't, wasn't made particularly welcome in the house. He made the decision to walk away, but it was not an easy decision for him at all.
There's a line in your book where Greg is quoted as saying that basically there wasn't room for him.
No, he no longer fitted in. He didn't have a purpose any longer. Greg Milton then said to me, and I quote, "I just convinced myself that in the interests of the children it was the best thing to do to just walk away."
The end of Gina's relationship with Greg marked the first in a line of familiar relationships that would end up falling apart. But it would not be the last time she marries. A few years later, she meets Frank, a tax lawyer from the US, and a man who is twice her age. She falls in love, she takes his last name, and she becomes Mrs. Gina Rinehart. Back at Mulga Downs, Brian is taking us to the grave of his relative Greg Tucker. It was Greg who told the story of saving Gina in the creek.
That old fella there grew me up.
Brian often comes back to Mulga Downs to visit his ancestors.
Just want to let them rest there because they are residing in their own traditional homeland, where they come from and where they've been buried.
When Lang died in 1992, Gina brought some of him here as well.
I remember if it was you or Juliet yesterday saying that Lang's ashes are behind here as well.
Yeah, in the back of Mulga Down here. I'm not sure where, but it's scattered there. Probably Gina wanted that. That's her business,
Throughout Gina's lifetime, Mulga Downs has changed so much. It's been completely transformed, not only by the mining industry, but by the Hancock family itself. And it's still changing. Just kilometres from where she lived, a new mining camp has been set up in readiness for Gina's latest project. It will be called the Mulga Downs Mine. Work could begin as early as this year. It will take up 16,000 hectares of the pastoral station of Gina's youth, about 4,000 of which will be cleared of native vegetation. Walk far enough in any other direction from Gina's family homestead and you'll likely find an iron ore mine, either owned by BHP or Rio Tinto or Fortescue, or another one of Hancock Prospecting's ventures. Gina has two within a few hours' drive, Roy Hill and Hope Downs, named after her mother. It's a joint venture with Rio Tinto. And there's even more planned. But as the land around him changes, Brian Tucker is holding on to Wirralamurra.
This is what left of our country. Everything has been taken up by government to do mining. But I just want this place here to be ours.
It's almost impossible now to imagine the Pilbara without the mining industry. It was interesting, I remember having a conversation with Brian and his sister Juliet back at Wirralamurra, and they were basically saying, we don't really have a choice now. It's here to stay.
I guess at the end of the day, we're working with them. We got no choice.
My homeland is the engine room of Australia. That's all I'm saying.
Is what they're driving the economy for each one of us, you, me, everybody. So you can't say nothing, but in traditional people like us, we got to live with it.
Next time on Gina, we examine Lang Hancock's role in kickstarting this industry in the Pilbara and the lessons he passes on to Gina along the way. Has she ever surprised you? Has she ever deviated from Lang's script?
I think you know the answer to that, and it is emphatically no.
I sort of, in some ways, I kind of feel like she had no choice, right? Because her upbringing was so isolated and he was so influential. It was always going to be thus, but yeah, I don't know, maybe that's not giving her enough credit.
Well, I think that this is such an obvious thing to say, but from what we know, I mean, she and her father were extremely close, personally. And to that extent, I suppose what you're saying is right, and that is that the evolution of her views, if you can call it an evolution, was completely not surprising and to some extent inevitable.
Guardian Australia contacted Hancock Prospecting and Gina Rinehart for comment, but we did not receive a substantive response. Gina is recorded on Parramac and Kaurna country. It is reported by me, Sarah Martin, and the series producer is Joe Koning. The executive producer is Shelley Hepworth, and Miles Martignoni is the head of audio. This episode was also produced by Jess Hamilton and Luca Idamani, who assisted with research and fact-checking. Additional production by Isabella Lee. Sound design in this episode was by Joe Koning. Debbie Marshall's book is called The House of Hancock, The Rise and Rise of Gina Rinehart. Another valuable source for making this series was Adele Ferguson's biography called Gina, The Untold Story of the Richest Woman in the World. We'll be back next week with episode 2.